Hello, thank you for joining me. Welcome to the sixth and final program in this series. In this video, which is in two parts and subtitled Synthesis, we shall explore how related musical elements can be combined consciously and deliberately in such a way as to promote unity, unlike the more or less unconscious synthesis that seems to have taken place over the course of musical history, as we outlined in the 5 previous videos. So, first of all, I want to start by sharing some feedback from two of my viewers. The first wrote, "You should have called the series Pythagoras and the Music of the Past, considering that you are talking about quite old concepts and exclusively old music on old instruments. We're not even talking about the present here, let alone the future." Whilst I wouldn't wholly agree, I can see the point. Because from the second episode on, we've engaged in a historical survey of how the correlations that exist between the frequency ratios of the harmonic series and the parameters of music have been part and parcel of its evolution. However, as I said in the first program, in this and the programs that follow, I aim to explore the correspondences that exist between the various elements that together make up music and how they have always been and always will be inseparable from the principles that Pythagoras propounded. So there is my justification for the use of music of the future in the title. I'm certainly not going to try and predict what the music of the future will be like. The second comment took the form of a highly pertinent question from one Ryan Power, who, by the way, creates a very interesting and useful channel of his own. How does one go about trying to compose their own materials using ratios for rhythm, harmony, and timbre? Answering that question while suggesting possibilities for contemporary and perhaps future composition is what this pair of videos is about. So let's begin with an example, again from the past, albeit relatively recent. In the third video of this series, we mention spectral music, the term coined to denote music conceived and structured in terms of the acoustical properties of sound sources. In 1975, Gérard Grisey, one of the acknowledged pioneers of spectral music, composed his Partiels. The title, partials in English of course, makes it very clear that the structure of the harmonic series was uppermost in the composer's thinking. Grisey took as a starting point an analysis of an instrumental timbre, in this case the trombone playing a low E, by means of a spectrogram. The spectrogram would have looked very much like this one, generated using software called Spear and a sampled trombone sound. It's perfectly fine for illustrative purposes. The trombone's forte, sustained note, which is very rich in harmonics, is heard several times at the beginning of the piece with simple rhythmic material, also on E, played by the double bass. As you heard, instruments enter successively playing tones corresponding to partials 2 to 20. The resulting aggregates of pitches, sometimes with octave displacements, mimic the electronic technique of additive synthesis. In this context, Grisey preferred the term instrumental synthesis. The natural frequencies of the partials are retained. That is to say that where they deviate from the 12 tones of equal temperament, they are not corrected, so to speak. The same frequencies are used melodically later in the piece, but again in non-harmonic intervals derived from the higher, less stable partials. Both of these procedures introduce an element of microtonality. You've no doubt noted that our discussion of Partiels has dealt mostly with pitch and timbre. But what of rhythm? Well, Gérard Grisey, along with other spectral composers such as Tristan Murray, also explicitly sought to re-establish the acoustical unity of pitch and rhythm. However, it's probably true to say that rhythmic movement in much spectral music tends to have the effect of creating moving textures or cross rhythms, rather than clearly delineated rhythmic gestures. But before going on to discuss approaches to rhythm and its integration with pitch and timbre, a note about the serialism of the early 20th century, which also attempted an integration of sorts. The composers who took Webern's music as their starting point perceived a mismatch between the highly structured pitch organization in Schoenberg's 12-tone music and the loosely structured rhythm, which remained firmly rooted in the 18th and 19th centuries. For them, this was no more of a relic of Romanticism. Take this example from Schoenberg's Fourth Quartet. If we distill the pure rhythm from this example, we see that it is very conventional. The serial composers objected strongly to this and demanded that pitch and rhythm, as well as a range of other parameters, be unified by means of the same organizing principles as pitch. Consequently, series of durations were devised and combined with constituents numbered in a manner similar to the pitch series. The problem with this approach was that since the numbers identifying the members of both the pitch and duration series were merely ordinal, there was no acoustical relationship between pitch and rhythm. The inner coherence, logic, and meaning rooted in nature and perception that underpinned earlier Western music had been abandoned. As I note in my video, The 12-Tone System in Context, the most prominent pioneers of serialism all turned away from it within a few years. Given, as we saw in a previous program, that all pitch and therefore all timbre is essentially rhythm, there is no reason why explicit, clear-cut gestural rhythms shouldn't be generated from the frequency ratios of the harmonic series. But how to go about creating such rhythms? The simplest method is to superimpose different values of tuplets as in this figure. This is fine for simpler ratios, but there comes a point at which they are very difficult to realize. For the sake of clearer notation, it is possible to use another, more mathematical method involving multiplication, then division. Let's start with a straightforward example where the ratio is 3 to 5. First, we multiply the values, which in this case, of course, give 15. We can then map these factors. That's to say every fifth note, then every third note. The result is a rhythmic pattern based on the ratio 3 to 5. Let's explore this further by taking the rhythm based on the frequency ratio 9 to 8. Here, the product is 72. We take every eighth note and map these against every ninth note. As we noted in a previous episode, the outcome is additive and non-retrogradable, which is true of all rhythms derived in this way, irrespective of the ratio. So now we can use this as our starting point in a very brief compositional process. Listen to it played on an unpitched percussion instrument. This can suggest pitch movement, but unlike Grisey's Partiels, where pitches are derived directly from the spectrum of an instrument, here they are chosen somewhat arbitrarily, improvised almost. What's important is that the resulting intervals can be analyzed in terms of frequency ratios, which in turn can be used to generate and develop rhythmic, tempo, and timbral content, thus establishing unity. The easiest way to do this is by means of a table such as this one. The multiplier column lists values for the second term as if the first were 1. This can be extremely useful in synthesizing timbres, as we shall see in the next program. Going back to our rhythmic starting point, I've added intervals together with degrees of flexibility in tempo, ornamentation, and microtonality. You'll notice that the prominent intervals in this example include the minor second and its inversion, the major seventh, as well as the minor ninth and tritone. There are also variants and inversions of major and minor thirds, as well as quarter tones. I'll continue using the same rhythm, but not in its original form. A retrograde form is not available to us since this is a palindromic rhythm, but we can rotate the constituent durations. After this, retrograde transformations become possible. We could, for example, generate a simple retrograde of the rotated rhythm, or we could work with the rhythm divided to create new but related patterns. You'll no doubt see other options for creating rhythmic variety with unity. For this phrase, I'll simply rotate the durations by one place. You'll notice that I leave one of the durations towards the end silent. Now we'll look at another possibility for rhythmic transformation, which is transposition. Now this word, as opposed to the more usual augmentation or diminution, might sound odd when used in relation to rhythm, since it's normally associated with pitch. However, since the concept of the pitch-rhythm continuum is central to the musical thinking under discussion here, and since these different designations describe essentially the same process, that of multiplying or dividing values, we can use the term transposition for both. Whereas in the past, rhythmic augmentation or diminution has mostly been in simple ratios, in the music of the present, and indeed of the future, rhythms can be transposed in ratios similar to those associated with the prevailing interplay of pitches. Here is our rhythm transposed in the ratios 16:15 and 9:8, the ratios of the minor and major second, respectively. One or more of these transpositions can be superimposed on the original to create a compound rhythm. Here is the original in its first rotation, overlaid with its 15:8 transposition. We'll base the third phrase of our melody on a variant of this. You'll notice here that one of the durations is subdivided. We saw the use of what I call a compound rhythm in that last phrase. Now, this or a configuration like it could be transposed in its entirety and then superimposed on a variant of the original to create a complex rhythm. Again, that's my term. In this example, rests have been simplified so as to give a clearer idea of the result. So you'll see there's no limit to the possibilities. But now we come to the question of how such rhythmic patterns can be articulated via timbre. Rendering rhythms such as these via simple harmonic timbres would be unconvincing and would create yet another mismatch of parameters. There is also the distinct possibility that we could end up generating rhythms that are impossible for human performers to realize with accuracy, and for listeners to discern whether they have in fact been played accurately or not. We'll be looking at both these questions in some detail in the next part of this episode. So please subscribe to this channel and click the bell. Make sure you're notified when it's ready. It won't be long. Also, please share this with whoever you think might be interested. So until the second part, which is coming soon, thank you very much for joining me, and I very much hope that you will join me again.